This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit Straightgoods.ca.
Oxfam works in 95 poor countries around the world. Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen a marked increase in the number and severity of conflicts and incidents of criminal violence. Disputes that once may have been settled with stones or fists are now fought with automatic rifles, grenades, and bazookas. It feeds a death toll that now stands at over 2,000 people every day. Part of the problem is how easy it is to obtain weapons. There are virtually no global rules on the trade in arms. There are more trade rules on bananas than on lethal weapons. Canada is one of very few countries that maintains rigorous controls to ensure that its arms exports do not get diverted into the wrong hands. Other countries routinely sell weapons and ammunition to known human rights abusers or to countries where corruption and incompetence allow weapons to fall into the hands of terrorists, drug dealers, and criminals. Now we have the opportunity to address this ongoing tragedy. A unique opportunity to bring the rest of the world up to Canada's high standard. A United Nations Armed Trade Treaty is under negotiation since 2009, and it will be hammered out in a marathon 4-week session beginning July 2nd. The mechanism in the treaty will be fairly simple. The governments of exporting countries would evaluate each shipment of weapons or ammunition as to whether these would lead to human rights violations or violations of humanitarian law, or if they would exacerbate conflicts, deepen corruption, or undermine development. When the answer is yes, the shipment would not go forward. Canada has been a quiet but steady supporter of a robust arms trade treaty to date, but Canada has left it to allies, including the United Kingdom, Mexico, and Australia, to lead, alongside the poor countries that have suffered bitterly from the flood of weapons. Now is the time for Canada to become a vocal champion. If Canada remains silent, opponents of the treaty will water it down or tie it up in red tape. Thousands of Canadians have voiced support for a robust treaty. So have 119 parliamentarians, several retired military officers, and 19 national organizations. We ask Mr. Harper to answer their call, our call, by making a public statement, and we urge Mr. Baird to attend the diplomatic portion of the negotiations in early July and to give Canada's negotiators a strong mandate to press for a treaty worthy of the name.
We believe that an arms trade treaty should embrace one simple idea. If there is a substantial risk that arms exported to another country will contribute to serious human rights abuses, those arms transfers must simply be stopped. What exists now in terms of regulating conventional arms is a patchwork of national, regional, and international rules and principles involving few common standards or obligations. There are significant gaps through which too many weapons simply end up in the wrong hands. The reasons are many, including alliances, politics, inadequate controls, and outright greed and corruption. 6 countries are responsible for 74% of the world's arms exports. Germany, plus the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the USA, the UK, France, China, and the Russian Federation. Though the Security Council has the primary responsibility under the UN Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security, the actions of the permanent 5 sometimes seem at cross purposes with this fundamental goal. The examples are far too easy to find. The USA, Russian Federation, and European countries supplied large quantities of weapons to repressive governments in the Middle East and North Africa before the 2011 uprisings, despite a substantial risk that they could be used to commit serious human rights violations. And in Syria, we're witnessing the tragic result of a business-as-usual approach to arms transfers. Thousands killed, arrested, tortured, and many more fleeing for safety over the borders. Russia, the same country that has blocked attempts to impose a UN arms embargo, is of course the main weapons supplier to the Syrian government. But it doesn't stop there. As renewed conflict flares up between Sudan and newly independent South Sudan, nothing is being done to stop the flow of arms in a context where civilians have endured indiscriminate aerial bombardment and upwards of 500,000 people have been displaced in the past year. Again, the Russian Federation, China, and Belarus are the main suppliers of Sudan's air force and military, while the SPLA in southern Sudan, where small arms are available in alarming abundance, are primarily supplied by Ukraine and Kenya. The U.S. has also recently announced that it will open the door to arms transfers to South Sudan. A new country is a potential new market. The human cost of an unregulated arms trade is simply too high for Canada and the international community to make compromises at the July negotiations. I'll now hand it over to Lina.
The treaty is for me an imperative. And as a Colombian, I have witnessed what the flow of arms can do. I've seen how the father of a friend of mine was killed when I was 10, when we were playing in the streets. I saw also the killing of friends of mine when I was just an adolescent. And I see how my family that still lives there lives in fears of proliferation of arms that are easily and ready available for anyone to buy.
One of the big concerns we have here is that we want to make sure that the full scope of conventional weapons are included, including ammunition. Because even if you stop the trade in guns, if you continue the trade in bullets, there's something like 12 million bullets produced a year, you can still do a tremendous amount of harm. And the U.S. is one of those countries that isn't quite sure about that full scope, particularly ammunition. So there's that concern. There's the other concern that in order to bring the U.S. into a treaty process, and as I said, they're often very hesitant to come into international treaty processes in a very robust way, that other countries that have a strong position will consider watering that down. So I think there are concerns on many levels involving the U.S. So to bring some people into the tent that it'll be watered down, the U.S. is one of those. And people will be watching very much what they do to see if they want to readjust. And for us, it's a matter of, we want to make sure there's a high international standard that we can point to, because right now there isn't an across-the-board standard. We want to make sure governments like Russia, China, U.S., for their different reasons, don't end up lowering that to a point where it's not really worth having a treaty. We'd rather have the negotiations go to a second forum than have the bar lowered that much.
With the treaty gaining a higher profile over the next month, can you anticipate a bit what the arguments will be of opponents of the treaty as they come out of the woodworks? What they'll say to say this treaty is a bad idea?
Oh, there's so many different arguments being used. Top two? Can we huddle here? Top two? Binding criteria? I think there have been some arguments that where there are existing international standards like human rights law and humanitarian law, that it's easier to point to what your obligations would be and the criteria used to judge particular shipments. We're trying to get a broader view of what risk is. And I think Oxfam in particular has been trying to bring in criteria that have to do with poverty alleviation and so on. Maybe let Lina say a few words about the importance of that criteria, but also some of the challenges around it. I think that and scope. People will say, well, maybe not this, maybe not that. But I think that's the big one. Lina?
Just to say yes on one of the things that we have been asking for is the inclusion of development criteria. What we mean by that is that if arms are going to be transferred to an X country, it needs to be evaluated whether this will contribute to aggravate poverty. And so there are several countries that consider that this should not be included in the treaty. And unfortunately, Canada is one of the countries that is not being in favor of this inclusion. And we hope that during the month of negotiation, this position will evolve.
Can you expand on that?
What the information that we have is that they don't consider that it should be part of the criteria. Canada doesn't consider that the development criteria should be part of the criteria. We do praise Canada for the fact that they consider that human rights and international humanitarian law are crucial and must be there. But we also think that there is an intrinsic link between armed violence and poverty and how it affects development.
It's not entirely clear what approach they'll take. We like the approach that Canada ended up taking, which I think was an important clarification. The thing about saying civilian weapons is a rifle is a rifle. I mean, most of this is around hunting rifles and sport shooting. And it's more about the end user of a weapon than, because you can't really say, like a rifle in the hands of a military is a military weapon. In the hands of a sport shooter, it's a sport shooting weapon. And our concern about seeking an exemption for so-called civilian weapons was really there's no category called that. What you want to do is ensure that civilian use that is lawful and legitimate is not interfered with by the treaty. And that certainly wasn't the intent of the treaty. And so the idea that Canada shifted to was to have language in the preamble that clarifies the purpose of the treaty. And we feel that's a very important distinction to have made, and we hope other governments will go that route. If people pursue that kind of exemption, it creates the sort of loophole in a treaty that allows mass human rights violations to take place. I mean, Amnesty did a study of 10 countries over 10 years and found that 60% of the human rights violations were connected to the use of small arms. So that's, ensuring that category is robustly covered is important. If there's anything in the treaty that starts to lower the bar there, the treaty may not be worth the paper it's written on. Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those things that I think a lot of governments will see where the wind blows and where the momentum is. And we'd really like a government like Canada to stand up and say, no, this is the principled approach to take, and this is why.